What's the most badass thing your grandma ever did? I rushed to the nursing home after getting the call that my 82-year-old grandmother with dementia had assaulted a staff member and was facing criminal charges and eviction. I found her in the director's office with a swollen right hand, while the orderly, a young guy named Josh, held an ice pack to his split lip. The director, 2 nurses, and a security guard were all staring at my grandmother like she was a wild animal. "Mrs. Miller has become violent," the director said immediately. "We cannot tolerate assault on our staff. Josh is considering pressing charges and will need to find her alternative placement immediately." My grandmother looked smaller than ever in the oversized chair, her white hair messy and her hands trembling. She'd been here 2 years since, and her whole life she'd never hurt so much as a cockroach. "Grandma, what happened?" I asked, kneeling beside her chair. She grabbed my hand with her uninjured one and squeezed hard. "He's been stealing my pain pills, sweetheart." The director sighed like she'd heard this before. "Mrs. Miller has been making accusations for weeks. She claims medications are missing, typical paranoid delusions common with her condition." "She punched me completely unprovoked," Josh said from behind his ice pack. "I was just giving her morning medications and she attacked me." My grandmother's grip tightened on my hand. "Those weren't my pills. He's been giving me sugar pills instead of my oxycodone." Everyone in the room exchanged those looks that meant they thought she was confused again. The director started explaining how dementia patients often become paranoid and aggressive, how they imagine conspiracies. I'd heard this speech before every time Grandma had told me the staff was mistreating her. Now I was starting to wonder if I should have listened. "Josh has worked here 5 years without incident," the director continued. "He's one of our best. Your grandmother has been increasingly difficult lately, refusing medications, making accusations. Show them the pills," my grandmother said to Josh. "Show them what you've been giving me." Josh shifted uncomfortably. "I already disposed of today's medications after she attacked me, but they were her standard prescriptions, her pain management and anxiety." "Liar," my grandmother said. "You've been doing it for weeks. That's why I've been in so much pain." The director was already pulling up my grandmother's chart on her computer. "Mrs. Miller has been complaining of increased pain, but we assumed it was disease progression." "When did the pain get worse?" I asked, my stomach starting to turn. "About 6 weeks ago," the director said slowly. "That's when he started as my nurse," my grandmother said. "My pain pills, my Xanax, even my Ambien. He takes the real ones and gives me fakes." The nurses exchanged glances now that looked less skeptical. "Why would I replace her medications?" Josh asked, but his voice had changed slightly. My grandmother looked him. "You sell them. I wasn't born yesterday." "These are serious accusations," the director said, but she was looking at Josh differently now. "We should check the medication counts." "Check all you want," Josh said confidently. My grandmother turned to me, and for a moment her eyes were completely clear. "Yesterday I confronted him privately. I told him I knew what he was doing. He leaned over my bed and said no one would believe an old woman with dementia." The room went cold. Josh's face changed before returning to injured innocence. "She's putting words in my mouth," he said quickly. "I would never say that." But one of the nurses had stepped back. The director was studying Josh. "Has anyone else complained about pain medications not working?" I asked. The director hesitated. "We've had several residents mention it, but with dementia patients it's hard to determine what's real. Mr. Johnson said his morphine wasn't helping," the younger nurse said. "Mrs. Garcia said her Ativan felt different. 3 people asked for dosage increases." "They're all dementia patients," Josh said quickly. "Of course they're confused." "But what if they're not confused?" I said, feeling rage building in me. "What if you've been stealing from people who can't defend themselves?" Josh stood up straighter. "I don't have to listen to this. I'm the victim here. She assaulted me, and I'm pressing charges." My grandmother was crying now, tears rolling down her cheeks. "No one ever believes us. We're just crazy old people waiting to die." I wanted to scream at everyone in that room. My grandmother, who'd raised me, who'd been a chemistry professor for 40 years, was being dismissed as delusional. "Test the pills," I said. "Test what he's been giving her." "I told you. I disposed of them after the assault," Josh said. "Protocol for contaminated medications." The director was typing something. "The controlled substance count should show if medications are missing. Everything will be accounted for," Josh said. But there was sweat on his forehead now. "I follow protocol perfectly." My grandmother squeezed my hand again and looked at the director. "Then it's good I kept evidence," she said clearly. "Evidence you won't be able to ignore." She reached into the bag hanging on her wheelchair and pulled out a small plastic container. The masking tape labels had dates written in her shaky handwriting going back 6 weeks. She dumped the pills onto the director's desk, and they scattered across the papers. Everyone leaned forward to look at the white tablets she'd been secretly collecting. The director picked one up and held it close to her face. She turned it over and frowned at the smooth surface with no markings or imprint codes. Josh's forehead was dripping sweat now, and he shifted his weight from foot to foot. "She must have tampered with them," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos of each pill from different angles. The younger nurse cleared her throat and mentioned she knew how to do a field test for opioids. The director hesitated and looked between Josh and my grandmother before nodding slowly. We all watched as the nurse left the room and came back with a testing kit from the medical supply room. She put on gloves and crushed one of the pills into powder on a clean paper towel. The test strip went into the powder and we waited while the nurse checked her watch. The strip stayed white instead of turning blue like it should for oxycodone. Negative, the nurse said, and held up the strip for everyone to see. The director's face went completely pale, and she turned to the security guard standing by the door. "Make sure Josh doesn't leave this building," she said in a voice that shook slightly. Josh started yelling that this was all a setup and demanded his union representative right now. The security guard stepped in front of the door and crossed his arms over his chest. Josh spun around to face my grandmother and his face twisted into something ugly. "You're going to pay for this," he snarled at her. Everyone in the room froze and stared at him like they were seeing him for the first time. The director grabbed her phone and dialed the state health department with shaking fingers. I pulled out my own phone and called 911 to report medication theft and elder abuse. My grandmother sat quietly in her wheelchair holding my hand while tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. She wiped them away with her free hand, but more kept coming. The 911 operator took down all the information and said officers were on their way. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers walked through the door with their notebooks already out. They started taking statements from everyone in the room one by one. Josh crossed his arms and refused to say anything without a lawyer present. One of the officers wrote that down and mentioned how suspicious it looked for an innocent person. The younger nurse pulled the second officer aside near the window and handed him a piece of paper. She'd been keeping a list of 12 other residents who complained about their pain medications not working. "I started tracking it 3 weeks ago when the pattern became obvious," she told him quietly. The officer's eyebrows went up as he read through the names on her list. Right then, the door opened and Iris Carlson from the state ombudsman office walked in without knocking. "I got your complaint from earlier," she said to me and looked around the crowded office. She immediately started pulling residents out into the hallway to interview them privately. The police officers asked the director to secure the medication room as a potential crime scene. They put yellow tape across the doorway and posted the security guard to watch it. The director went to her computer and started pulling up Josh's medication administration records from the past 6 months. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she cross-referenced the schedule with the complaint list. "He was assigned to every single resident who complained," she said slowly as the pattern emerged. She scrolled through more records and her frown deepened with each page. "He also volunteered for overtime shifts every week that gave him solo access to the medication cart." The room was silent except for the clicking of her keyboard and my grandmother's quiet sniffles. Josh's face had gone from red to white, and back to red again. The police officers were writing everything down and asking follow-up questions about the facility's medication protocols. Iris Carlson came back into the office with 3 pages of notes from her resident interviews. She looked at Josh with cold eyes before turning to speak with the officers. More staff members started gathering in the hallway trying to see what was happening. The director had to tell them twice to get back to work and take care of the residents. My grandmother squeezed my hand harder and I squeezed back to let her know I was there. Josh kept looking at the door like he wanted to run, but the security guard wasn't moving. The younger nurse was showing the officers how the medication cart worked and where the controlled substances were kept. They took photos of everything, including the lock that Josh had keys to access. The director printed out stacks of records showing Josh's shifts and medication counts for the past year. One of the officers called for backup and a detective to handle what was becoming a major investigation. My phone kept buzzing with texts from other family members who'd heard something was happening. I ignored them all and focused on making sure the police had everything they needed. The evidence was piling up on the director's desk next to the fake pills my grandmother had saved. 3 hours later, I was wheeling my grandmother into the emergency room while she gripped the armrests, so hard her knuckles went white. The triage nurse took one look at her pain level and moved us straight to a bed where the ER doctor checked her chart, and his face got dark. He started an IV right away and pushed pain meds that made her whole body relax for the first time in weeks. While we waited for blood work, he kept shaking his head and asking how long she'd been suffering like this. The lab rushed the toxicology screen, and 40 minutes later, the results came back showing 0 therapeutic levels of oxycodone in her system, even though her records showed daily doses for 6 weeks. The doctor printed the results and told me this was criminal neglect that required immediate reporting to Adult Protective Services. Within an hour, Rachel Langley showed up with a clipboard and a serious expression on her face. She sat down next to grandmother's bed and started asking questions about the nursing home while taking notes about everything. Rachel mentioned this was the 3rd complaint about that facility just this month, which made her think there were bigger problems happening. Back at the nursing home the next morning, Joshua Tran arrived with boxes of paperwork and started going through every controlled substance log from the past year. He spread sheets across the conference table and used different colored highlighters to mark Josh's signatures on waste entries and medication counts. After 2 hours, he found patterns showing Josh signed off on way more waste documentation than any other staff member. The detective called me that afternoon to say they'd gotten a warrant for Josh's locker and wanted me to know what they found. The search turned up 12 empty prescription bottles with the labels scraped off plus $3,000 in cash wrapped in rubber bands stuffed in a gym bag. Josh couldn't explain where the money came from when they questioned him at the station. Word spread fast through the facility, and by evening, other families started showing up demanding answers about their loved ones. Roberto Michel's son cornered me in the hallway and said his dad had been telling everyone the morphine wasn't working, but the staff kept saying he was drug-seeking. The man's hands shook as he described watching his father cry from untreated pain, while nurses insisted he was just confused. Then Mila Harmon's daughter found us and started crying as she explained her mom's Ativan had seemed different for weeks. She'd noticed her mother getting more anxious and agitated, but thought it was just the disease getting worse until she heard about the investigation. Now she wondered if her mom had been suffering from fake medication this whole time. Detective Camden Holt set up in a small office and started interviewing each family one by one to build a timeline. He had a whiteboard where he mapped out when each resident's complaint started and cross-referenced them with Josh's shift schedule. The pattern showed Josh's thefts started small 6 months ago, with just a few pills here and there, then escalated each week. By the time grandmother caught him, he was stealing from at least 15 residents every single day. The director spent all night going through computer records and discovered Josh had administrator access to the medication ordering system that he shouldn't have had. She found orders for medications that never showed up in the official inventory, plus shipments of what looked like placebo pills from sketchy online suppliers. The paper trail suggested Josh was systematically replacing real medications with fakes he bought online for pennies. The next morning, Heidi Thurman arrived from corporate headquarters with 3 lawyers and immediately took over the director's office. She pulled me aside and offered to move grandmother to a private room with free care for life if we agreed not to sue or talk to the media. I told her to take her offer and shove it because my grandmother deserved justice, not bribes. Heidi's face went red, but she kept her voice calm and said we should think carefully about what was best for grandmother's care going forward. The lawyers started pulling files and making calls while more police officers arrived to expand the investigation. Joshua Tran kept finding more evidence in the medication logs, including forged signatures and altered timestamps on electronic records. One officer mentioned they were treating this as a major drug trafficking case now, not just simple theft. Families kept arriving throughout the day as word spread through social media and local news picked up the story. The parking lot filled with angry relatives demanding to know if their loved ones were victims too. Inside the facility, residents who could still communicate started sharing their own stories about medications that didn't work right. Mrs. Taylor down the hall said her anxiety pills tasted different starting 3 months ago, but nobody listened. Mr. Rodriguez in the memory unit kept refusing his medications lately, and now everyone wondered if he knew something was wrong. The younger nurse who'd supported grandmother earlier pulled me aside to say she'd been documenting complaints for weeks. She showed me a notebook where she'd written down every time a resident mentioned their pills seemed off or didn't help their symptoms. The list had 37 names on it, with dates going back 4 months. She handed the list to Detective Holt, who'd just arrived to expand the investigation. The next morning, the lab called with results on grandmother's saved pills, and the technician sounded shocked when she told me they were just lactose and cornstarch pressed together. She said these fake pills matched the type sold online as movie props, but sometimes criminals use them for medication fraud. The detective immediately got a warrant for Josh's arrest while I sat with grandmother as she ate her first real breakfast in weeks. 3 police cars pulled up to Josh's apartment that afternoon and found him trying to flush pills down the toilet. They charged him with drug diversion, elder abuse, and fraud, while news crews filmed him being led away in handcuffs. His mugshot appeared on the 6 o'clock news with the headline about a nursing home orderly stealing from dementia patients. The facility's phones rang nonstop as more families called to report their loved ones had complained about medications not working. By morning, Josh had hired Xavier Ayala as his defense attorney, who immediately went on local news claiming his client was scapegoated. Ayala said Josh was just a low-paid orderly who made one mistake, but the evidence kept piling up against him. Detective Holt found Josh's computer had searches for how to make fake pills and where to buy pill presses online. The pharmacy delivery driver remembered Josh always volunteered to help unload medications, even though that wasn't his job. I brought my phone to grandmother's room on one of her clear days and helped her record a video statement for the investigation. She sat up straight in bed and explained clearly how the pills looked different with no markings or numbers on them. She said she'd saved them in dated bags just like she used to document her chemistry experiments at the university. The video showed she understood exactly what was happening even with her dementia diagnosis. Detective Holt expanded the investigation when he discovered major problems with the pharmacy delivery records at the facility. The invoices showed medications ordered, but the inventory logs showed different amounts actually received by the nursing staff. It looked like Josh had been intercepting deliveries in the parking lot and swapping real pills for fakes before they reached the locked cabinet. 3 employees came forward the next week saying they'd suspected Josh was doing something illegal but were scared to report him. One nurse said Josh always joked about making extra money on the side, but she didn't understand what he meant. Another said Josh was best friends with the assistant director, so nobody wanted to risk their job by making accusations. The 3rd employee, a janitor, said he'd seen Josh in the medication room after hours multiple times but assumed he was catching up on paperwork. Detective Holt's tech team cracked Josh's phone and found he'd been selling the stolen opioids on the dark web using cryptocurrency. The digital records showed he'd made over $50,000 in 6 months just from stealing medications from elderly residents. He had accounts on 3 different illegal marketplaces where he advertised pure pharmaceutical-grade oxycodone and other controlled substances. The detective said this was one of the biggest elder abuse cases he'd ever investigated. The nursing home announced they were doing a complete audit of all medications and bringing in independent doctors to retest every resident. The chaos disrupted everyone's care as families scrambled to figure out what their loved ones had actually been getting. Some residents had to be hospitalized when doctors realized they'd been without proper medications for months. Others needed immediate psychiatric evaluations to adjust anxiety and depression medications that hadn't been working. The facility brought in temporary nurses, but they didn't know the residents and made constant mistakes with basic care. Grandmother finally started getting real pain medication, and within days her whole personality changed for the better. She could sit up without crying and even walk to the dining room with her walker for the first time in weeks. Her thinking got clearer too, and she told me she'd known people wouldn't believe a woman with dementia. She said that's why she had to gather proof the same way she used to document her chemistry experiments with careful notes and samples. 2 weeks after Josh's arrest, Jillian Finn from the district attorney's office took over the case from local prosecutors. She called me to say she was charging Josh with 15 counts of drug trafficking and elder abuse based on the evidence. She explained each count could carry serious prison time, and if convicted on everything, Josh might face 20 years behind bars. The media coverage exploded when reporters learned about the scope of Josh's crimes and how many vulnerable people he'd hurt. Families started connecting on social media to share their stories and demand better oversight of nursing homes. The state health department launched their own investigation into how Josh had gotten away with this for so long. The nursing home tried to keep things quiet, but a reporter from Channel 7 showed up 3 days later with a camera crew. The director refused to let them inside, but they filmed from the parking lot while families walked in and out. That evening, I watched the news with grandmother and saw her picture on the screen next to the headline, "Nursing Home Orderly Accused of Stealing Pain Pills from Dementia Patients," while the reporter explained how Josh had been arrested. The story spread online, and by morning, dozens of people were sharing it on Facebook with angry comments about elder abuse. Josh made bail 2 days later after his parents took out a second mortgage on their house to cover the $50,000 bond. The judge had issued a restraining order saying Josh couldn't come within 500 feet of the nursing home or any of the residents. But that same afternoon, one of the nurses called me to say Josh had been spotted driving slowly past the facility in his car. The police arrested him again within an hour, and this time the judge revoked his bail completely, calling him a flight risk and danger to witnesses. I started looking for a new place for grandmother because the nursing home felt unsafe and chaotic with all the investigations happening. Every decent facility I called had waiting lists of 6 months or more. The good ones wanted medical records, references from doctors, financial statements, and detailed care assessments that would take weeks to gather. Meanwhile, grandmother had to stay in a place where half the staff had quit, and temporary workers kept making mistakes with basic care. The state health department sent a team of inspectors who spent a whole week going through every single medication record and interviewing staff. They found the facility had been ignoring complaints for months without proper documentation or follow-up. The medication room had broken cameras that nobody had fixed for over a year. Staff weren't doing proper counts when shifts changed. Nobody was checking if residents actually got better after medication increases. The report listed 17 major violations that could result in the facility losing its license. Roberto Michel ended up in the emergency room when his blood pressure hit dangerous levels from weeks of untreated pain. His son told me Roberto had been begging for stronger medication, but staff kept saying he was drug-seeking. The hospital said Roberto could have had a stroke from the stress his body was under without proper pain management. Roberto's son hired a lawyer and filed his own lawsuit against the facility for gross negligence. Then Josh's girlfriend contacted the prosecutor's office after seeing the news coverage. She said Josh had been giving her pills for months that he claimed were samples from drug companies visiting the nursing home. She thought it was normal until she saw the arrest report and realized she'd been taking stolen oxycodone meant for elderly patients. She brought a bag of pills Josh had given her and agreed to testify about how he bragged about making extra money on the side. The nursing home's insurance company sent their own team of investigators who interviewed every single employee over 3 days. Several nurses admitted they'd noticed the controlled substance counts seemed wrong sometimes, but figured it was just paperwork mistakes. One nurse said she'd mentioned it to the previous director 6 months ago, but was told not to worry about it. Another said Josh always volunteered to do the medication counts alone, which she thought was helpful, but now realized was suspicious. We had a meeting with the prosecutor about grandmother's testimony, but it went badly. Grandmother couldn't remember what day it was, or recognize the prosecutor, even though we'd met her twice before. She kept asking where her husband was, even though he'd been dead for 10 years. Josh's defense attorney was there and kept pointing out how confused grandmother seemed. He asked her basic questions about the case, but she couldn't answer most of them. The prosecutor reminded everyone that the physical evidence was clear regardless of grandmother's current mental state. The saved pills, the lab results, the video statement from her good day, all proved Josh's crimes. But it still hurt watching grandmother struggle to understand what was happening. Joshua Tran finished his complete audit of the pharmacy records, and the results were worse than anyone expected. He found evidence that at least 40 residents had been affected over the past 2 years, not just the 15 they'd identified initially. Josh had been careful at first, only stealing from 1 or 2 residents at a time. But in the last 6 months, he'd gotten greedy and started taking medications from anyone with dementia who couldn't fight back. The audit showed patterns where Josh would increase his thefts right before holidays or when he had big expenses. Families started calling me after seeing the news, asking if their loved ones might have been victims too. I started a support group that met Tuesday evenings in the basement of First Baptist Church downtown. The first meeting had 8 families, but within a month we had over 30 people showing up. We shared information about lawyers, compared notes on symptoms our relatives had shown, and worked together to find better facilities for those who wanted to move. Some families had been told for years that their loved ones were lying about pain or making up stories about missing medications. One woman cried as she told us about her mother begging for help but being dismissed as attention-seeking. We made a list of every complaint that had been ignored and gave it to the prosecutor as more evidence of systemic failure at the facility. 2 days after that support group meeting, I got a call from the facility saying they needed to meet with all families immediately. When I arrived at the conference room, about 50 other families were already there, all looking confused and angry. The corporate team was at the front with their lawyers, and Heidi Thurman stood up to announce that the director had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. A new temporary administrator walked in, some guy in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never worked in healthcare before. He started talking about protecting the company's reputation and limiting liability, not once mentioning the residents' care or safety. Several families started shouting questions about their loved ones' medications, but he just kept reading from his prepared statement about following proper protocols going forward. The next morning, I got a call from Jillian Finn at the district attorney's office telling me Josh's lawyer had filed new motions. Xavier Ayala was claiming his client had addiction issues and needed treatment instead of prison time. I drove straight to the courthouse where Jillian showed me the paperwork, and my hands were shaking as I read it. Josh was trying to paint himself as a victim of addiction who needed help, not a criminal who targeted helpless old people. Jillian told me not to worry because she'd already filed a response pointing out that Josh deliberately chose the most vulnerable victims who couldn't fight back or report him. She had statements from 15 families showing how Josh specifically waited until residents developed dementia before stealing from them. The hearing was set for next week, and she wanted grandmother to testify via video if she was having a good day. I spent the next 3 days at grandmother's new facility, waiting for one of her clear moments. Finally, on Thursday morning, she woke up completely aware and recognized me immediately. We rushed to set up the video equipment while she was still sharp, and Jillian arrived with a court reporter. Grandmother sat up straight in her bed and calmly explained how she'd used her chemistry knowledge to recognize the pills weren't right. She described the texture, the weight, the way they dissolved differently in water. Xavier tried to confuse her with aggressive questions about dates and times, but she stayed focused on the physical evidence. She even explained the specific chemical tests she'd done in her bathroom using old supplies from her teaching days. The whole deposition took 2 hours, and grandmother never wavered once. That same week, the state health department announced they were moving to revoke the facility's license completely. They'd found so many violations in medication management that they called it a danger to public health. The corporate lawyers immediately fought back, arguing that one bad employee shouldn't punish hundreds of residents who needed care. They brought in experts who testified about the shortage of nursing home beds in the state. But the state inspector had photos of the medication room showing broken locks, missing logs, and expired drugs everywhere. The judge gave them 30 days to fix everything or face immediate closure. The chaos at the facility got worse when 3 nurses quit, rather than face investigation. 2 more called in sick and never came back. The remaining staff was working double shifts, and families had to come in to help with basic care. I found grandmother's former roommate sitting in a wet diaper because no one had checked on her for hours. Other families started hiring private aides just to make sure their relatives got fed and bathed. The facility tried to hire temporary workers, but word had spread about the investigation, and no one wanted to work there. One afternoon, I was leaving the courthouse after another hearing when an older couple approached me in the parking lot. They were Josh's parents, and his mother was crying as she begged me to ask for leniency. She kept saying he was a good person who made mistakes, that prison would destroy him. His father stood there silent, looking at the ground while she talked. I reminded them that Josh stole pain medication from an 82-year-old woman with dementia, that grandmother suffered for 6 weeks because of their son. His mother started sobbing harder, but I walked away because I had no sympathy left to give. Detective Holt called me that evening with new information about the investigation. They'd discovered Josh had specifically targeted residents who had no close family visiting regularly. He'd accessed employee records to see which residents got the fewest visitors, then made sure he was assigned to their medication rounds. Grandmother was an exception because I visited twice a week, but he thought her dementia was bad enough that she couldn't gather evidence. Holt said Josh had even kept a notebook rating residents by how likely they were to report problems. The detective had more news that made my stomach turn. They'd connected Josh to an online drug ring that specifically recruited healthcare workers. He'd been active on dark web forums where criminals taught each other how to steal medications without getting caught. The forums had guides on which drugs were worth the most, how to fake documentation, and which types of patients to target. Josh had even posted advice for other thieves about avoiding cameras and fooling drug counts. The FBI was now involved because the ring operated across state lines. 2 weeks before the trial date, Heidi Thurman called to offer a settlement. The facility would cover all of grandmother's medical expenses for life and pay for her placement in a premium facility. They'd also set up a fund for other affected residents, though the amount was insultingly low. I told her I wanted more, that every single victim deserved full compensation for their suffering. We went back and forth for days, with me demanding they cover therapy, pain and suffering, and ongoing medical monitoring for everyone Josh had stolen from. Finally, they agreed to a number that would actually help the victims, though they made us sign papers saying we couldn't talk to the media about the amount. The morning Josh's criminal case was supposed to start, Jillian called to say he'd accepted a plea deal, 12 years in prison with no chance of early release for 5 years. He also had to pay restitution to all his victims, though everyone knew he'd never have enough money to make it right. The judge would formally sentence him next month, and families could give victim impact statements if they wanted. The sentencing date came 3 weeks later, and I helped grandmother practice her victim impact statement every day. She was having more good days since getting proper pain medication again, and on the morning of sentencing, she woke up clear and focused. The courtroom was packed with families from the nursing home, all of us watching Josh sit at the defense table in his orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I remembered. Grandmother stood at the podium gripping her written statement with both hands. She told the judge about the 6 weeks of pain that made her cry at night when no one was listening. She explained how the worst part wasn't even the physical suffering, but being called crazy and delusional when she tried to report what was happening. Her voice stayed steady as she described feeling trapped in a body that hurt, while people who were supposed to care for her dismissed her as confused. Josh kept his head down the whole time she spoke. The judge listened carefully and took notes while grandmother explained how she'd used her chemistry knowledge to recognize the fake pills. She said she kept evidence because she knew no one would believe an old woman with dementia without proof. When she finished and sat back down beside me, half the courtroom was crying. The judge took a long time before speaking. He said Josh had shown particular cruelty by targeting the most vulnerable members of society who couldn't defend themselves. He noted that Josh had violated the sacred trust between caregivers and patients. The judge sentenced him to the full 12 years with no possibility of parole for 5 years. Josh started crying as the bailiffs put handcuffs on him, and several families in the gallery actually clapped until the judge told them to stop. His parents rushed out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. 2 days later, Heidi called about the settlement negotiations. The facility had agreed to pay $2 million divided among all affected families, which worked out to about $50,000 per family after lawyer fees. They also promised to install cameras in every medication room and require 2 staff members present for all controlled substance handling. The money would help, but it couldn't undo the weeks of suffering grandmother and the others had endured. I spent the next month researching new facilities for grandmother. Most had waiting lists, but I finally found a smaller place with only 30 residents and an excellent reputation for pain management. The director there had followed our case in the news and was horrified by what happened. She personally promised that grandmother's medications would be closely monitored and any complaints would be taken seriously. The staff there seemed genuinely caring, and the building was newer with private rooms and a garden where residents could sit outside. Moving day was hard because grandmother got confused about why we were packing her things. But once we got to the new facility, she seemed to relax, especially when the nurses explained their medication protocols and showed her the locked cabinet where her pills were kept. They even let her watch them count out her medications each time, which made her feel safer. About 3 months after the sentencing, I got a call from a state senator's office. They were drafting legislation requiring additional oversight of nursing home medication practices and wanted our input. The bill would mandate surprise audits, require facilities to test medications if residents complained, and create a hotline for reporting suspected theft. The senator said they were informally calling it Mrs. Miller's Law, which made grandmother laugh when I told her. She said if they were going to name something after her, she'd prefer it be about her chemistry research on polymer bonds, not about getting punched in the face by a drug thief. 6 months after moving to the new facility, grandmother was doing so much better. Her dementia hadn't improved because that's not how the disease works, but with proper pain management, she was comfortable and even seemed happier. The staff actually listened when she raised concerns about anything, not just medications. She'd made friends with another resident who used to teach physics, and they spent hours arguing about scientific theories neither of them fully remembered anymore. Meanwhile, the old facility was falling apart. The state investigation had led to massive fines and dozens of lawsuits from families whose loved ones had suffered. They'd lost so many residents that they couldn't afford to stay open. 8 months after Josh's arrest, they declared bankruptcy, and the remaining residents had to find new places within 30 days. The building sat empty for months before being sold to developers who turned it into apartments. The whole thing became a cautionary tale that administrators discussed at healthcare conferences about what happens when you ignore complaints from vulnerable populations. Rachel from APS called me one afternoon to share some good news. Our case had led to statewide reforms in how complaints from dementia patients got investigated. Instead of automatically dismissing concerns as confusion, Investigators now had to look for physical evidence and patterns across multiple residents. She said 3 other facilities had already been caught stealing medications using the new protocols. The changes wouldn't have happened without grandmother's evidence collection, which had proven that dementia patients could still recognize when something was wrong, even if they couldn't always articulate it clearly. About a year after everything started, I received a letter from a family in another state. Their mother had been in a facility where an aide was stealing her anxiety medication. Because of the publicity around our case, the daughter knew to demand testing of the pills, which revealed they were fake. The aide got arrested and the mother got proper treatment. They wanted to thank grandmother for being brave enough to collect evidence when no one would listen. I read the letter to grandmother on one of her good days, and she smiled. She said she was glad her chemistry training had finally been useful for something important. A few weeks later, Detective Holt called with an update. Josh's girlfriend had agreed to testify in another trial about the drug ring he'd been part of. She was providing information about how the network operated, including names of other healthcare workers who were stealing from patients. Her testimony had already led to 12 arrests across 3 states. The FBI estimated that hundreds of elderly victims had been affected by this ring that specifically recruited people working in nursing homes and hospitals. Josh was apparently cooperating too, hoping to get his sentence reduced, though the prosecutor said that was unlikely given the severity of his crimes. The investigation kept expanding as more healthcare workers got caught and agreed to provide information about others in exchange for lighter sentences. The state sent us a letter 6 months later asking grandmother to testify at a Senate hearing about elder abuse. I drove her to the Capitol building on a day when her mind was sharp, and she walked into that hearing room wearing her best dress and her reading glasses on a chain. The senators sat behind their big desk while grandmother took the microphone and started talking in the same voice she'd used to teach chemistry for 40 years. She explained how residents with dementia still notice when pills look different, even if they can't always explain what's wrong. She showed them photos of the fake pills she'd saved and told them about the weeks of pain she'd suffered while everyone thought she was just confused. The senators asked questions and grandmother answered each one clearly, explaining that vulnerable residents need regular pill testing and better oversight. One senator said they'd never heard such clear testimony from someone with dementia, and grandmother smiled and said she still had good days even if they were getting fewer. The younger nurse who'd first supported us called me a few weeks later with news that she'd gotten promoted to medication supervisor at a different facility. She said our case had taught her to always listen to residents no matter their cognitive status, and she'd started doing random pill tests every week at her new job. She'd already caught 2 cases of incorrect medications, just by testing what patients received against what they were supposed to get. Detective Holt called one afternoon while I was at work to tell me Josh had been attacked in prison. Another inmate whose grandmother had died in pain from stolen medications had cornered him in the laundry room and broken his nose. I told Holt I didn't wish violence on anyone, but I understood the anger, and he said Josh was in protective custody now, but still had 11 years left on his sentence. A year passed and grandmother still lived in her new facility where they took her pain seriously. She kept all her pills in a clear container on her nightstand and sometimes joked with the nurses that she was ready to collect evidence again if anyone tried anything. Her good days were less frequent, but she never suffered from untreated pain again, which made even her confused days more bearable. The support group I'd started in that church basement grew into something bigger when families started donating money to help others fight similar cases. We filed for nonprofit status and began lobbying for laws requiring cameras in all medication rooms and independent audits of nursing homes. We got 3 bills passed in 18 months, including one requiring quarterly pill testing at all facilities with vulnerable populations. 2 years after everything started, grandmother's body finally gave out, but her mind was clear that last day. She died in her bed with proper pain medication keeping her comfortable while I held her hand, and my cousins stood around her. At her funeral, dozens of families came to pay respects, many of them people we'd helped through our organization, or who'd followed our case in the news. They called her the chemistry professor who outsmarted a criminal, and someone brought a framed newspaper article about her Senate testimony. I kept working with the advocacy organization after she died because I knew she'd want the work to continue. Her evidence collection method became a protocol we taught families nationwide, showing them how to document problems even when no one believes them. We distributed thousands of guides explaining how to recognize fake pills and what legal steps to take when facilities ignore complaints. Sometimes late at night, I'd think about Josh sitting in his prison cell and feel this strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Part of me was glad he was suffering for what he'd done to grandmother and all those other residents, but another part felt sad that it had come to this, that someone could be so cruel to people who couldn't defend themselves. Mostly, though, I felt grateful that grandmother had been brave enough to fight back when everyone said she was just a confused old woman with dementia, that she'd used her chemistry knowledge one last time to prove she wasn't crazy, and that her suffering had led to real changes that protected thousands of other vulnerable residents from the same fate. Well, that's gonna do it for today. Thanks for letting me wonder through all these curious details with you. It's been really fun sharing this time together. Take care, and like the video, it helps more than you think.